We're on this journey. In ancient prayers, they used to pray to people who would take sacred journeys, Kyrie eleison, Lord, have mercy. And we can certainly use a little of his mercy today. And we could certainly use a little bit of the mercy as we've heard the story read to us of David counting the fighting men of Israel. The Bible doesn't tell us what it was that caused David to count the fighting men of Israel. All it says is that Satan had incited David to count the fighting men of Israel. Now you can imagine all sorts of things that Satan would probably have thrown at David. Probably not unlike the things that he throws at us. He causes us doubt. He causes us to be tempted. He wants to make us lie. He deceives us. He hurts us. He hurts the people whom we love. He comes into our families and disrupts our families. He comes into our churches and destroys churches. He's a thief and he steals. And what he ultimately wants to steal from you is the joy that is your salvation. That's what Satan wants to do. Now you can imagine that King David, this is the same King David who as a boy slayed the big giant Goliath. And I told the first service, and I'll tell this second service, that I remember a number of years ago, Richard Jordan preached a sermon on this very topic of David and Goliath. And Fran, I think, had made a life-size outline of Goliath. Do you remember that? I mean, this thing towered over Shaquille O'Neal, and it certainly towered over you and me. It caused an entire nation of Israel, God's holy people, to tremble when he came out on the battlefield. And that little boy David, you remember the song, Only a Boy Named David? He walks out on that field with a sling and 5 stones. And he bats 1,000. One stone in the sling, round and round his head it goes, shot through the air at high velocity, embeds itself into the giant Goliath, and Goliath falls down. So David, being a warrior king, the Bible describes him. You can imagine that he's got lots of enemies, a plethora of enemies. Every nation surrounding his is an enemy. And when you have lots of enemies, and we have lots of enemies sometimes, they like to gang up. They put aside their differences for a moment in time to gang up on the big dog, Israel. So David has all these enemies. And I can imagine that possibly the enemies of the other nations are going to come against Israel with their combined forces. And so David forgets that at one time he had slain the giant Goliath by going at him in the name of the Lord of hosts. He forgets that and instead decides to put his trust in the might of men. And so he sends a decree out and says, I want you to count everyone who can carry a sword, all the fighting men that are capable of carrying a sword. And they're going to initiate this nationwide draft and send the boys to war. And they come back with this enormous number. 1 million plus. Isn't that what you read? 1 million plus. Big army. I'm ready to go to war now. 1 million. We can take them. The odds are in our favor. He counts the fighting men of Israel. And that doesn't even include 2 of the tribes of Israel, whom Joab didn't want to count. He just decided at some point, enough is enough. I don't like to count. I'm not counting these other 2. The Bible says that he didn't like the fact that he had been asked to do this. He either didn't like that, or the writer of this text is much more gracious to Joab. Joab just couldn't count that high. So David has this enormous army. The problem is that this has angered God. It's upset him. Now come on, God has a right to be upset when his children misbehave or disappoint him, the same way that you as parents probably have a right to be upset with your children when they misbehave and disappoint you. Or church leaders sometimes can get upset and disappointed when church members don't behave like you think church members should behave. But in this case, what upsets God the most is he's been forgotten. See, God doesn't need 1 million people to go into battle for him to win the day. Come on, church, we remember the good Old Testament stories of Gideon and 300 fighting men that took on the entire nation. We remember the little boy David. You see, we remember those stories here when we come to church, when we're going to get a star next to our name. But when we go out in the real world, where we really live and we really do our work and we really exist, we sometimes forget those stories. And we begin to look to answers to our problems in places that have nothing but counterfeit solutions. We forget that God is still dominion over everything that we see, over all the earth which He created, over the entire universe. We seem to forget that. We seem to forget that God is bigger than you and me, and He's bigger than everything that I can see. We forget it. See, we're not too unlike David. You see, Satan gets the best of us. And I'm not pointing fingers. I'm not saying you're a bad person. I'm saying you're just like the rest of us. We all, the Bible says, fall short. And David does too. So here's what happens. God sends a messenger to David and says, you're going to be disciplined, and I'm going to give you 3 choices. And I love it when I get disciplined and I get choices. But I want you to think about this. I want you to put yourself in the shoes of David. You get 3 choices. You can have 3 years of famine. There'll be no eating. There'll be no buffet. There'll be no eating after church. It hurts. I'm already hurting. And I got a lot more to live off of than some of you. You can have 3 months of running away from your enemies. And David probably thinks, no thank you. I've had that before. I ran away from Saul and I didn't really much like that. Or you can take 3 days. 3 days, plague upon Israel. 72 hours. Now, we just sent the kids out of the room, but what do you think? If they disappointed you today and you said, all right, Sammy, we're going to not feed you for 3 years. We're going to chase you around the neighborhood with a switch for 3 months. Or you're going to be sent to your room for 3 days. That's a plague in their eyes. Sent to your room for 3 days. 3 days being sent to your room. Man, you know what you would take. I know what I would take. 72 hours, 3 days, the shortest punishment possible. I will take it. Sold. Sign me up. But here's the problem. The plague comes upon Israel, the nation of Israel, because the king chose to make a decision, and the punishment and discipline comes upon his people. And it's not until after 70,000 have died, and the angel of the Lord is standing over Jerusalem with a sword in his hand, ready to pronounce judgment upon this holy city, that David says, wait a second. I made the decision to count the fighting men. I did it. These are the sheep of Israel. I alone should be the one who is punished for such a thing. You know, sometimes it's very hard to accept some of the discipline that God pours out. I admit that. I wrestle with the Lord over discipline sometimes. But it's out of these moments of wrestling that growth is produced. You remember that it's when Jacob wrestled with the Lord, that it's only then that the Lord gave him a new name and said, you will be Israel, and through you I will change the world. So wrestling with the Lord is not such a bad thing if it produces growth.